Clear, not all rural areas are the same, and not all areas of rural areas are as rural as people think they are because of the role of information and access to internet.
有部分人士认为，乡区信息不流通，让地方上的选民无法了解国家问题，因此在投选候选人的时候无法做出全面考量。不过，诺丁汉大学亚洲研究所的名誉研究员魏解认为，随着网络的便利，这种说法已经不成立。
I think one of the things that's really important is to recognize that the people in the rural areas make informed decisions. They make informed decisions because they're concerned about access to services, in terms of the development in these areas, access to the economy in terms of jobs, questions of wages. They look to at things very locally. So they're not concerned about this issue of corruption because corruption for them is something that is far away. They don't see it and connect it into their daily lives. They're concerned with the actual issues of governance locally, the prices of rubber, the issues of the roads, and also the importance of having somebody personally that you can go to who, if there are problems to address. And this is where the local parties, especially BN, traditionally UMNO, have had an advantage in rural areas because they are physically in those places. Many of the Harapan candidates are parachuted in or not necessarily living in these areas. So there isn't that same connection at the local level.
虽然乡区选民能够掌握资讯，但生活所需和基础建设这一类的结构性问题，让他们只能够依赖政党。
We have to look at the rural areas very differently. They're not all the same. I think we see in the Felda areas different particular generations, right? And in the Felda communities, there are real serious problems of social mobility. But at the same time, the government's presence, UMNO's presence, is still very strong. And so therefore, there are not as many alternatives. But we are seeing alternatives in places that PAS has grown as a political party. And this, for example, we can see in the Felda areas in places like Terengganu. And even when they're trying to cut into other places like Parkta National is in Johor. There's a fierce battle now taking place in these Felda areas. The rural communities in Sabah and Sarawak are very different. We have much higher levels of poverty. People living in longhouses, people living in communities that don't really even have services at all. And so these dependent relationships are fostered. And, they don't have access to schools. They don't have access to water, electricity. We're talking about things that are very serious. So when you ask me the question of what can be done, one of the big issues that Malaysia faces is to improve infrastructure in these rural areas, to provide a more level playing field for people who live in these rural communities. Right now, during the election campaigns, they become vulnerable to the use of vote buying. And this is unfortunate. But at the same time, for the rural folks in many of these places, they look to the here and now as opposed to the broader national picture. Information and education is changing that. Rural areas cannot be taken for granted. And we've seen in the last series of elections that these areas are highly contested, and they continue to be this election as well. I think that the real question becomes is when is Malaysia going to have a meaningful discussion about the role of agriculture, the role of food security, and to move away from a kind of dependence relationship for the rural communities. These are not so easy. Many of the things that the agricultural growth is in palm oil, and palm oil doesn't necessarily translate into food security for many of the communities in these local rural areas. And they also benefit businesses that are attached to the government, as opposed to helping and changing the issues of the livelihoods of communities. So what is involved here is also a change in the economic trajectory, a meaningful conversation about how rural areas are being developed, particularly with the issues of the environment. We see some of these debates taking place in Pahang, this particular election at the local level, but it is not something that is being discussed at the national level. And I want to reiterate what I said earlier. Not all rural areas are the same, and not all areas of rural areas are as rural as people think they are because of the role of information and access to internet. Some of that, unfortunately, is also disinformation. But there is a connectivity now, and I think this is where one of the most important battlefields are taking place in this election. It's a question of whether or not BN will hold on to these areas as it has in the past, and it is being more challenged.